Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. I want to address one of the greatest deceptions in modern political history, which is that under the presidency of Bill Clinton, we accumulated surpluses and balanced the federal budget for the first time in many years. This is not true, and it never was true. It has been debunked before, but I don't feel it has been explained in a way that the average person can understand it, which is what I want to do today, is show you that we did not have surpluses and we did not balance the budget under Bill Clinton. Under Bill Clinton, the budget surpluses were said to have existed between 1998 and 2002. So the first surplus was in 98, and was said to have been the first surplus since the 1960s. Back then we had a surplus of $3 billion in 1969. If these surpluses were real, it would have been the first time that we accumulated 4 straight years of surpluses since the 1920s. The size of these surpluses were $69.2 billion in 98, $125.6 billion in 99, $236.2 billion in 2000, which was the biggest surplus in American history if you look at total number of dollars, and $128.2 billion of surplus in 2001. Now we know that George Bush became president that year, so that was not a Clinton year, but it's still seen as part of the Clinton legacy of surpluses. Here is the reason why people should not believe that we ever had any surpluses, because the national debt went up every single year that we were claimed to have been balancing the budget. In 1998, the national debt went up $110 billion because the national debt hit $5.47 trillion, when in 97 the debt was $5.36 trillion. So it went up $110 billion from the year before. In 99, it went up another $130 billion. In 2000, it went up another $20 billion. And even though $20 billion is minuscule in terms of the total national debt, it still went up. The reason it went up only $20 billion is because back in 2000, we had the biggest surplus in history, $236 billion. So the government did not see it as necessary to borrow but less than 1% of the total debt, which was $20 billion, but it still borrowed and the debt still went up. In 2001, the debt went up another $140 billion, hitting $5.76 trillion from $5.62 trillion from the year before. We have to ask ourselves as citizens, why did the national debt rise every year as the federal government accumulated budget surpluses? In fact, this is illogical, because if you have a surplus, your debt falls. If you have your debt rise, you never had a surplus. In fact, you had a deficit. So for the national debt to rise while we have surpluses is totally illogical. It totally defies math, because surpluses mean negative debt, and having positive debt or growth of debt means having a negative surplus or a budget deficit. So this is something that has not been very well explained, but it's actually very simple if you just look at the facts. The surpluses only appear in something called the gross federal debt held by the public. I underlined held by the public to show you the difference between gross federal debt held by the public and something called the gross federal debt. There are 2 measurements of debt. One is the federal debt and the other is the federal debt held by the public. In this statistic, you see surpluses. But in the federal debt number, you do not see surpluses at all. We have to know what the difference is between the 2 different measurements in order to understand why surpluses appear in one and not in the other. Gross federal debt held by the public measures debt held only by private investors. I will talk about who those private investors are in a second. it excludes debt held by government accounts. I will talk about what those government accounts are in a second. If we look at the gross federal debt, which is the total debt, it measures debt held by private investors and by government accounts. Government account debt is known as intragovernmental debt. That's debt that came out of government programs, government accounts, government agencies. In other words, the federal debt, the gross federal debt, measures all debt. It measures money the government borrowed from private investors and money that it borrowed from itself. Now, who are the private investors and what are the government accounts? These charts come from the Government Accountability Office's website. So it is coming straight from the federal government, and it tells us everything we need to know about where the government borrows money. This is the light green box and the dark green box. If you add these two together, this is the total national debt. The dark green box shows debt held by the public, which was $14.7 trillion last year, because this is fiscal year 2017, and it is accounting for debt held by the public and intragovernmental debt. So debt held by private investors was $14.7 trillion last year. Debt held by government accounts was $5.6 trillion. If you add the 5.6 to the 14.7, you get the total national debt, which is $20.4 trillion as of last year. It's higher now, but it was $20.4 trillion last year. Now, the private investors, who are they? They are made up by state and local governments, the Federal Reserve, which is a private bank, domestic private investors, that includes individual people, nonprofit organizations, and businesses, meaning proprietorships, partnerships, corporations, LLCs. Your international investors are also considered private investors. These are your foreign countries, China, Japan, Brazil, and many others. These are also foreign companies and foreign individual investors. These make up your private investors. Your government accounts, meaning the government borrowing from itself, is made up by Medicare, meaning the government borrows from Medicare to pay other debts. Military retirement and health care accounts, civil service retirement and disability funds, and other accounts that are not listed here, but the biggest is Social Security. More than half, 52%, of all of the money that the government borrows from itself comes from the Social Security Trust Fund to pay bills. So if you add all of this up, this is the total debt. If you're just looking at debt held by the public, then you are only seeing about 3/4 of the national debt. And to leave out a full quarter makes all the difference between whether or not your debt rose or fell during any particular period. This statistic, the gross federal debt held by the public, can be found on the Federal Reserve of St. Louis's website. This blue line shows you how much money the government borrowed going back to the 1940s from private investors. This period here is where the line curves down, and it shows that there were surpluses and that the debt was falling. But once again, you cannot look at this as a measurement of the total debt, because it does not show you the total debt. It just shows you debt from private investors. I'll zoom in on this, and you'll see that the debt actually, if you're looking at private investor debt, it fell. The line curves down from 1998 to 2002, and you see what it looks like, surpluses and a balanced budget. According to the statistic that we just looked at, the national debt fell by $400 billion between 1997 and 2001. But if you look at the real number, the real statistic, the gross federal debt, again, another chart found on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis's website, shows how much the total money the government borrowed going back to the 40s, and you'll see right around here there is no surplus. The line is at best flat and at worst slightly tilting upward. I'm going to zoom in and show you just how flat the line is. So this is the period where we supposedly had the Clinton surpluses. There is no dip in the line. It's flat and slightly tilting upward. It shows that we never had any surpluses and that the debt grew, because this is accounting not just for private investor debt, but also for intragovernmental debt. And if you look at the numbers, it shows that the debt rose by $400 billion, showing you that the national debt was $5.3 trillion in 97. If you look at the held by the public number, it says the national debt was $3.7 trillion and dropped $400 billion over the next 4 years. But if you look at the total debt number, it shows the national debt was $5.3 trillion in 97 and rose by $400 billion over the next 4 years. So it really does matter which statistic you're looking at. And if you want to look at the most accurate statistic, you look at the total debt or gross federal debt, not the gross federal debt held by the public. This solid black line here shows debt held by the public once again. A curve down in the line around late 90s, early 2000s showing surpluses. But if you look at this dotted line, which is the intragovernmental debt, the line is going up during the period when the solid black line is turning down. This shows that the government was borrowing larger amounts of money from itself than it was paying down with the surplus from private investors. So this, and I'll zoom in just to show you, when you're looking at the debt held by the public statistic, you have surpluses. But if you're looking at the total debt, you have a deficit because the line is curving up. This is what is not explained very well by those who talk about the Clinton years. The last time we actually saw the national debt fall was 50 years ago, and it fell by $3 billion, dropping from $368 billion in 1968 to $365 billion by 1969. That was a real surplus. How do we know a real surplus when we see one? Because the national debt actually fell. If you have a surplus and the national debt does not fall, it is not a real surplus. How much did the government borrow from itself during the Clinton years? Add the total amount of the surplus to the total amount of the debt to find out. And you will get the total amount that the government borrowed. So, for example, in 1998, the government borrowed $69 billion and yet accumulated a $110 billion deficit. You add those two together and you'll find out that $179 billion was borrowed from the government's own trust funds and agencies in order to finance deficit spending. What we should get from this is that the government actually borrowed tens of billions of dollars more from itself than it accumulated in the surpluses, meaning that the surpluses only existed on paper. They never existed in federal finances, because if they did, the national debt would have dropped during the Clinton years, and instead it rose. The Clinton surpluses were fake. They were never, ever real. For those who believe that we had surpluses and that the budget was balanced, the last time that actually happened was under Nixon. It was not under Clinton. So, for those who want to talk about the Clinton years being a very successful time with finances, just remember, that's not true. In fact, it's all about manipulating data and statistics. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we will hope to see you in the next video.